Great, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity. Apologies up front to those of you who were on the Grassland Society conference last night. I see Tim Prance was chairing our session last night. Tim, some of the slides will be in common, but I think that'll be fine. It's only the first few slides. So soil carbon, there's a lot of debate and discussion around soil carbon and the challenges and opportunities. So I thought I'd present today very much what we know in science and what we can prove about soil carbon. So that's what I'm trying to stick to. But I thought I'd start with some definitions to get us going just around carbon farming and where some of the drive comes from. Carbon farming is a very recent term that is coined mainly through the Carbon Farming Initiative, which is now morphed into the Climate Solutions Fund and the Emissions Reduction Fund. But its management principles that firstly seek to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, maximize carbon sequestration in the landscape while also improving the productivity and resilience of the agricultural system. So designed not to have a negative impact on productivity, hopefully an improvement in productivity. Carbon neutrality is something that came in more recently following the Paris Climate Change Agreement, where there was a target of carbon neutrality by 2050, and we're seeing countries, subnational jurisdictions, but we're also seeing supply chains and industry driving towards carbon neutrality by certain dates in the future. Very similar to carbon farming in that it's management that minimizes greenhouse gas emissions, but it also recognizes that maybe in some livestock systems or agricultural systems, we can't eliminate these greenhouse gas emissions. So it says, in order to have a net zero position, you need to offset the balance of those emissions through sequestration of an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide in soils or vegetation. So I mentioned both of these because it has relevance to soils. Now, why carbon farming and why do we have this discussion around the soil carbon cycle? We talk about common efficiency metrics in agriculture. We talk about nitrogen use efficiency, we talk about water use efficiency, energy use efficiency. Why don't we talk about carbon use efficiency? When we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, nitrogen makes up 3.2% of your pastures are nitrogen, whereas photosynthesis capturing CO2 into your pastures, those pastures are made up of 43 to 48%. Almost half of your pasture is carbon. We should be talking about carbon use efficiency. How efficient are we in our farming system at capturing carbon into those plants through better basal cover, better leaf area, better grazing management to optimum leaf stage? And then how efficient are we at then capturing that carbon that's now in the plant into either the animal in the form of proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, because that animal that stands there is about 23% carbon. But then what of the carbon we don't capture in the animal, how much do we capture in the soil and retain as part of healthy soils? And then energy efficiency, how efficient is your farm at converting sun energy? So it's more than diesel and electricity, it's about sun energy and how efficient are we? So I see this carbon use efficiency or emissions intensity as another metric for how efficient we are in our farming operation. And to get into the carbon cycle and to explain how I see the soil carbon cycle, I've got this diagram. If you want a more detailed article on this, we published this in the Australian Farm Policy Journal recently about carbon neutral livestock. But you've got CO2 in the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, our pastures capture that CO2. Now, you'll note that the carbon fractions in each of these diagrams is in red to show you that carbon is not carbon. So we've got CO2 carbon in the atmosphere, and we've got CHO, carbohydrate, which is also a form of carbon now sitting in the plant as a result. So the one's a gas, the other one is a sugar. There's some respiration which sends carbon back to the atmosphere from the plant, but in the main it is CO2 captured through photosynthesis. We then put the animal on, and the animal grazes, and there is a fair amount of CO2 that the animal then belches through rumination and breathes out back to the atmosphere as CO2. There is a small amount, and I emphasize it's small, it has a big impact, but it's small in the big scheme of things, of CH4. So that's methane. It's a small, it's a very fundamentally different gas to CO2. It's CH4, and it has a different warming effect on the atmosphere to CO2. But then there's organic forms of carbon. So obviously the animal drops feces, which is in a form of carbon. There's litter that drops from decaying pastures onto the soil surface. Some of that litter enters the soil and becomes part of the soil carbon cycle. The majority of that litter just oxidizes off the surface back to the atmosphere as CO2. Then there's plant roots that lead to certain forms of soil organic carbon being deposited in the soil. A small amount of that dissolved organic carbon can leach with water, run with the water wherever that goes. Now, there's some debate about what form the plants contribute to this soil organic carbon. The majority of the way in the scientific literature would suggest that it's just decaying roots that contribute to soil organic carbon. But there is some evidence that plants exude certain sugars, carbohydrates, and that fungi in the soil feed on that and contributes to a different form of carbon being laid down in more humic fraction. Now, all this carbon in the soil contributes to various pools of carbon. There's no sort of magical cutoff between these various pools. It's just you've got some bigger fractions that are in fast turnover pools that we loosely call particulate organic carbon, and some finer fractions over time that then we call the humus. Now, for good, healthy soils, we want as much of that as possible. But there is a purpose of that carbon in the soil. It's not to stay in the soil permanently. The way our systems work in maximum healthy soils is we like to see that carbon turn over because the microbes get at it, they break it down, they decompose it, they release the nutrients that are sitting in that soil organic matter, and that then feeds through, for example, in a good, healthy, long-term pasture, you can get as much as 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year out of the turnover by microbes of this soil organic matter feeding your pasture, and that's where the nitrogen comes from. Now, in that process, the CO2 goes back to the atmosphere from where it came. So hopefully that clarifies the carbon cycle. The idea is we produce meat, wool, milk, for example, forms of carbon. When those are consumed by humans, we release the CO2 back to the atmosphere as well, and the cycle completes itself. Now, in carbon farming, what we want is meat, wool, and milk to be maximized. We want that carbon to be as much as possible to show efficient conversion of sunlight energy into the product we're interested in. We also want the long-term store of carbon to be high in the soil. And we want the methane fraction to be as low as possible in the soil. Now, just going on to soil carbon, we talk about soil carbon, and that's become quite current in our terminology because of climate change agreements and global warming and the ability of soils to draw down carbon out the atmosphere. However, in agriculture, we should actually be talking more about soil organic matter. Now, there is a relationship between the two, so you can calculate one from the other, but soil organic matter is so much more than soil organic carbon. And so we should be careful in our language to differentiate what are we actually talking about. In the main, in soils and soil health, we're talking about soil organic matter. Now, I point this out because for healthy soils, productive soils, for soils with high microbial diversity, for climate change resilience benefits, we want soils that have high soil organic matter. But we want it mainly in that fast turnover fraction so that it can actually feed our system with the nutrients it releases when it's broken down. So we want that cycle to be quite dynamic, talking about days and weeks rather than years. When we're talking about climate change mitigation and carbon offsets, we're talking about wanting high soil organic carbon or high soil total carbon, actually. But we want it more in a resistant form. We want it more in a slow turnover pool because we want some confidence to be able to trade this carbon and know that it'll be there in 20 to 100 years' time. So we want more resistant forms for carbon trading, but they confer less productivity benefits. In actual fact, what you'd want is most of the carbon to be in the charcoal form because it won't change over thousands of years. So I think often we don't reconcile that these might not be the same objective. For healthy, productive pastures, you want high soil organic matter. If the carbon levels go up as a result, that's a bonus. But for climate change offsets, you're actually looking for a different type of carbon. That's what I would suggest. Now, there's lots of benefits to soil organic matter. It is just really good practice to build soils that have high soil organic matter for a range of reasons, not the least of which is adaptation to climate change. And I would ask, is the payment there already? And I'll show you some recent work we've done on this to try and quantify that. But this is a slide some of you would have seen before from Jeff Bollock, just indicating what are the benefits of having high soil organic matter to a grazing system, and their biological roles like the nitrogen release that would come with it, higher biodiversity in the soil. There's physical roles like greater soil plant available water holding capacity, which means that system will be more productive in a more variable climate. And then there's chemical roles like buffering the pH of the soils. So a whole multitude of benefits there of having high soil organic matter. Some of the challenges around soil organic matter is, and this is an experiment that's been running for over 300 years in Rothamsted in the UK, where it came out of conventional cultivation, cropping, and then put into permanent pasture. And you can see how the soil organic matter increased over time. So yes, all the gains were had early on, but it takes a long time for the changes to occur. So you can see after 300 years, it's leveled off in the amount of carbon, and it's reached a new steady state. There's a law of diminishing returns that we often ignore when it comes to building soil carbon. There is a finite capacity of each soil by management combination, soil, rainfall, climate by management combination, of how much soil can be stored in a soil. So for example, for a conventional cultivated soil under wheat, every year cultivated in a sandy soil, having 1.5% soil carbon would be a good outcome. But if you were in a high rainfall permanent pasture on a clay soil, you would be looking for 6% carbon in the soil. And that's that top end of this graph. The other point that's made here is that whatever management change you have made to build that carbon or set yourself on that top line, the purple trajectory, you have to maintain that management, because the moment you change it, in this case, for example, they stopped adding nutrients, but it could be conventional cultivation, again, disturbing the soil, you drive that carbon back down to a new steady state. And to get it back up on that upper trajectory, you have to put it back on the same management again, under the same conditions. So we often forget those rules. Another thing about stored carbon is that starting point really matters. In the right of the diagram, you'll see a graph there of some work we did using the long-term site at Hamilton. So relative high rainfall grazing system. And the top two lines, the solid lines, represent two different soil types at Hamilton under starting conditions, long-term permanent pasture. And you can see not much change over 20 years if pasture remains pasture. You've built up a good carbon level and you're maintaining it. In the bottom dotted lines, we've assumed we've come out of some form of soil disturbance, and there is an opportunity to build carbon as it goes into permanent pasture. And so you can see the starting point actually matters, because eventually those dotted lines will catch up to the solid lines if you go on for, say, 100 years. So moving from cropping to pastures at a high rainfall site, we saw a fair bit of carbon sequestered. But with long-term pasture, under stable management, under good rotational grazing management, probably maintain pretty much the status quo. And the key with soil carbon that we've come across in Australia in particular, and this is why sometimes overseas literature doesn't really work for us, is that rainfall is a very important driver. In fact, I would go so far as to say rainfall is 90% of the impact on soil carbon, and your management is about 10%. Because you can see here the site at Birchip, low rainfall, how there is a direct correlation between the carbon in the soil and growing season rainfall. Where you move into more well-watered areas, so not that Hamilton is particularly high rainfall, but the correlation is weaker. So if you take data out of Europe, for example, where rainfall is not as much of a limitation, the soil carbon data doesn't actually add up quite the same as it does in a rainfall challenged environment like Australia, where rainfall really determines a lot of what goes on. Now, a colleague of mine, Warwick Badgery, did some work at Condobolin, and I found some very interesting results where they had a number of treatments, conventional cultivation through to permanent pasture, and they saw over an 11-year period a constant increase in soil carbon. So that bottom left-hand diagram there showing all the treatments increased in soil carbon over that 12-year period, but mainly in the fast turnover pool fraction. But then after 2012, between 2012 and 2015, unexpectedly all the treatments crashed. And they crashed across all the treatments. Of course, the permanent pasture treatment was better than the rest, which we would expect, but all of them declined in soil carbon, which means it wasn't management related, it was environment related. And so they concluded in this study that monitoring temporal changes in soil organic carbon over 12 years was still not long enough to indicate long-term sequestration, permanence of soil carbon. We need to keep that in mind when we talk about trading carbon. Now, what about the benefits? There are very clear benefits to having high soil organic matter. So this is again that work we did at Hamilton and Birchip to look at slightly high versus lower rainfall areas. And you can see the bars here, and this is just the nitrogen mineralization from those systems. This is the extra nitrogen you get from having good, high soil organic matter versus a soil that might have come out of cropping into permanent pasture. And you can see that at the Hamilton site, there was probably more from nitrogen than there was from the Birchip site, but two different soil types at each location, high and low carbon. And the difference was somewhere between 24 and 77 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year more from the high carbon soils, or high soil organic matter soils, than from the low. Now, if you had to monetize that, it actually is worth a fair bit of money. Then there was another, when we looked at the low rainfall site where rainfall was more challenging, we saw that plant available water holding capacity, just the ability of high organic matter soils to hold more water for longer, had a big productivity benefit at this site on two different soil types. So there you can see a soil with high carbon and a soil with low carbon and associated low plant available water holding capacity, and the productivity benefit difference of the two. So a big difference just in the ability. So I've just shown you two, trying to sort of give you some idea of the productivity benefit of just two of the many attributes of having some high soil organic matter. Now, if you had to monetize that in some way, you'd say, if you had to go and buy the hay equivalent of that production difference, just for the plant available water holding capacity, you've got $26 to $73 a hectare at the low rainfall site. If you had to then say at the high rainfall site, what was the value of the nitrogen mineralization in terms of extra hay, can be as much as $95 a hectare. Or if you had to say, let's go and buy urea to replace the nitrogen we would have got from the soil organic matter, there's $85 to $100 a hectare at the high rainfall site. So I guess the point I'm making here is that, and this is only two attributes, the monetary value of having high, good soil organic matter as opposed to low, just in terms of two of the attributes that are that soil organic matter confers. If you had to put it all together, it would look more impressive. Now, there are some challenges, and climate change itself is a challenge because soil organic carbon, organic matter is an input-output equation. You need to put the inputs in terms of plant growth, but the outputs remain fairly constant because they're microbes working at the soil. So in a drought, for example, the inputs go down because plant growth goes down, but the microbes are still actively working. So the output equation of the input-output still operates at about the same level. So that's why during droughts, generally soil organic matter goes down because the inputs have gone down, the outputs stay constant. Now, what we did here was looked at a number of future climate scenarios at Birchip and Hamilton, and I've just shown you two soil types here. The top series of graphs that you can see are various climate change scenarios for the high carbon starting point, and the lower section of each of these graphs is future climate scenarios going out to the future from a low starting point. What you can see in all of these graphs is that while some growth in soil carbon is possible, if the more negative climate scenarios result, so we're talking about the browner colors rather than the greener colors. So if you follow the brown lines and say, if climate warms and we get less growing season rainfall into the future as a result of those scenarios, we will struggle to hold on to soil carbon because the inputs go down while the outputs continue to be the same. And then we ran our models over this and said, well, here we have on the left-hand side of this diagram, we've got the Birchip site. On the right-hand side, we've got the Hamilton site, and we've got the soil types across the top, high and low carbon scenarios, but don't get lost in the detail. Generally above the line are the optimistic future climate scenarios, and below the line is the trade-off in stocking rate as a result of negative climate scenarios. So if you look just below the line here, we can see in drier future climates, which is probably what our current reality is. At Birchip, we're looking at a trade-off. If you want to maintain current soil organic matter stocks, there would be a 80 to 95% trade-off against stocking rate. In Hamilton, there would be a 40 to 50% trade-off in stocking rate to maintain current soil organic matter stocks. So I think we need to be realistic. We need to be building soil organic matter for the health of our system, but I am cautious about trading soil organic matter on the basis of this type of data. So in summary, to finish off, many soils are degraded globally, tend to be more degraded in cropping systems than under permanent pasture, but permanent pastures that are poorly grazed, poorly managed, overgrazed, will have opportunities to increase soil organic matter. Most of our permanent pastures that are well managed would have maximum soil organic matter. So after 50 years, that diminishing returns diagram I showed you would say that most of you would have soil organic matter levels that are close to their optimum that they can be. But some pastures can be improved through nutrients, through better species composition, and through better grazing management. I would say building soil organic matter is fundamental to the long-term health of our farming systems, fundamental to the long-term productivity of the farm system, and vital for improving the resilience under climate change and a higher variable rainfall regime in the future. But soil organic matter or soil carbon cannot increase indefinitely. We can't year on year increase it indefinitely, and can be challenged under future climate change. So we need to be realistic that we build soil organic matter in our farming systems for the health of our farming system. Let's not focus just on soil organic carbon for carbon trading. Let's focus on the productivity benefits that we get from having healthy soils for the future. So thank you very much. Presuming I'm handing back to Melissa.
You're on mute, Melissa.
Does anyone have a question for?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I think I'm not sure what's happened to Melissa. She isn't coming through. We might step to the questions that have come through on the poll. I guess straight to the top. I'll just manage the chairing until Melissa comes back on again. But Richard, the first question. To what extent is soil water retention increased by increasing soil carbon?
Yeah, look, Jeff Baldock did some really good work on that. I can't give you the exact figures in my head, but soil carbon itself probably has an indirect effect. It's soil organic matter, just to define it. So soil organic matter does make a substantial difference to the ability of soils to hold water, because the water is actually absorbed into the organic matter. And that then can be accessed by plants for longer, which means you can survive longer drinks between rainfall. I don't have the actual figures in my head as exactly how the relationship works, but if anyone's interested, I could dig out he's got this great diagram that shows the relationship between the two.
Thanks, Anne. I'm back online. I'm not sure. I think we've got a number of co-hosts. We'll try to unmute myself at the same time, so my apologies. Thank you, Richard, for your excellent presentation. That was fabulous. Yeah, my question is, I've got a question. What do you think about biochar to build soil carbon?
Yeah, look, biochar, there's a couple of things with biochar. Yes, inputs of biochar into the soil will increase the carbon in the soil. You've got to be careful you're not just transferring from one source to another. In other words, you've got an organic matter somewhere and you've picked it up and just relocated it. And so the total carbon was to the left and now it's to the right. Where biochar is properly charred, in other words, it is pyrolyzed through more than about 600 degrees, it becomes a more recalcitrant form of carbon, and therefore, if you put it in the soil, will be a permanent form of carbon. But the problem with that is it doesn't confer as much productivity benefit to the farm. If the biochar is not fully charred, it can have great productivity benefits to the soil because it's adding nutrients to the soil, it's adding potassium, it's adding nitrogen, and it's adding that organic matter. But it's not a permanent form of carbon. It's then a highly labile form of carbon that will oxidize fairly quickly. So it depends what benefit you want. If you've got a cation exchange problem in the soil, then perhaps fully charred charcoal will actually address that. If you have a productivity benefit issue, and you want to use biochar to improve the soil carbon, the soil organic matter, then you wouldn't char it fully.
Okay, yeah, well, that's great. So one of the other next top question is, what do you think happens to the soil organic carbon after a fire?
Oh, the fires definitely burn the litter off the surface, but they don't have much of an impact on soil organic matter. You know, really severe fires will go somewhat into the soil, and your topsoil will be affected. And you know, we know that 95% of your organic carbon is within the first 10 centimeters. But as far as I understand, well, I guess it depends on how far the temperature goes in, but there's not a lot of depth of burning down into the soil. So yes, it'll affect the surface few centimeters, but not further down.
Okay, thank you. Look, as a consultant who works with producers to try and help them build soil carbon, I think that there's a lot of room still, especially in South Australia and Southern Australia, to build our soil carbon. I think that there's practices that we could do better, that we've probably traditionally done differently. For example, you know, maybe too heavy a grazing. We see that a lot in the Mallee region where we've got exposed soil, but also the inputs and you know, regenerating pastures, we see the carbon go down. So I think that there's opportunity to improve our soil carbon. Do you have any comment on, you know, there's a school of thought that, you know, our average soil carbon in pasture systems may have been around 10 to 15% before we cleared, and now on average across Australia it's around 1%.
Yeah, look, those figures do go around. I would say there is almost no evidence that in the low rainfall regions of Australia that there was 8 to 10% soil carbon. I think in the rangeland systems you would be talking more at maximum 6% carbon. To get that 8 to 10%, I'll give you an example. Where you will see an 8% soil carbon is in a New South Wales coast kikuyu growing in a drainage ditch to stabilize the drain. So you've got a very vigorous growing grass like kikuyu growing in subtropical conditions, generates a huge amount of root material, and it's got limitless water. That's where you will easily get your 8% soil carbon. But to try and achieve that in somewhere in sort of Western Victoria, north of Colac or sort of Hamilton, you know, historically, you would probably be talking about 6% soil carbon 100 years ago.
Okay. And did Anne ask the question about how useful is labile carbon test to understand high turnover carbon? Has that been asked already?
Labile carbon tests. So you know, the standard Walkie-Black LECO test tests for the total carbon. There are tests that use fractionation as well that Jeff Bollock published a fair bit on, that will actually separate your particulate or your rapid turnover more labile from the more resistant forms. So that's a mid-infrared technique that a number of labs have got now. So it can be important to differentiate because you know, you can have different size pools. That experiment I showed you from Warwick Badgery, most of the change was actually in the particulate pool, in the more labile fractions. And the reason why is because that's where if you make a management change initially, a lot of it will sit in the rapid turnover pool. So understanding that that's where it sits and can easily be lost, as opposed to it sitting in the humus and can actually be there for longer term, can actually be quite important in understanding what your management might do.
Okay, thank you. Look, there's a question in the chat there about, do you have any thoughts on building carbon by spreading compost?
Yeah, look, in any form of organic material, if you put it into the soil, again, you've got to be careful of, you know, the actual carbon in the compost itself is carbon that was here and is now there. So there's not new carbon. But the benefit of adding the compost to the soil is that you do generate more microbial activity, you do generate more plant growth as a result of a healthier soil. And it's that additional plant growth and the additional microbial activity that generates more carbon than there would have been otherwise. So it's not the actual compost that you've added that adds carbon to that. Well, it does add carbon to that soil, but the net carbon in the whole world didn't change. You just moved it from one place to another. But there is a productivity benefit from adding that compost to the soil.
Okay. So look, there's a school of thought with, you know, every 1% you increase your soil carbon, and as you alluded to, you increase your water holding capacity by maybe 10 to 30 tonnes, and your agricultural productivity increases as well by maybe 10 to 30%. I'm just throwing some figures out there. If this is the case, and you work closely with federal governments, the incentives there to build soil carbon, I know, are there financially, as you presented as well, but wouldn't it make sense for federal government to further incentivise farmers to build soil carbon because they're using less water, which is a really important fact around the Murray-Darling Basin, but then also increasing the agricultural productivity, with the federal government having to get to this increase in agricultural productivity by 2030. What's your thoughts on the federal government and the incentives that are there at the moment to further incentivise farmers to build soil carbon through the emission reduction fund?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are methods there available at the moment. And unfortunately, we heard last night that the overheads of registering for a method are very significant. So the paperwork involved and the obligations involved are very significant and almost outweigh the benefits, in my view. I have this dilemma about paying farmers to build soil carbon when the data I showed you of the productivity benefits are there staring at them. You know, the productivity benefits in that study that I showed that are somewhere around $100 per hectare. In that same scenario, the carbon trading benefit was $14 a hectare. So you're getting $100 a hectare of soil available nitrogen and water, productivity benefit to build soil carbon. I think we've just missed communicating that message of the inherent productivity benefits of building healthy soils. And we focused on the carbon trading, which will give you $14 a hectare when there's $100 looking at you. And I think any federal government would struggle to incentivize financially something where there is an inherent productivity benefit that farmers are already capturing. So I would say there's some benefits that the federal government can do in the carbon offset methods in reducing red tape, in providing more airborne sensing, remote sensing, cheaper ways of validating soil carbon. And certainly there's a lot of effort going into that at the moment to take away the cost of monitoring soil carbon. And I think that'll incentivize, or that'll make the current offset methods more profitable than they currently are. But there is a productivity benefit we mustn't lose sight of that is probably the biggest incentive.
Yes, I agree, but it's not catching on. And, you know, with agriculture, farmers owning 50% of Australia, and, you know, you can drive, I drove recently from South Australia to the Hay Plain before border shutdown, and there was just vast areas of exposed sand where, and I think it's a win-win because federal government needs the increase in agricultural productivity. So the further incentives, although they're already there, to me would make sense to help build that productivity. But also we're in a climate emergency. And so the benefits for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and sinking it into the soil from a worldwide perspective would also make sense. And so it's a win-win because you can tick all of those boxes.
Fully agree with you. Exposed soil is a big loss of not only carbon but nutrients. I mean, we blow nutrients around the district as well. I mean, I don't know if you saw that media release of the African dust cloud that had reached America, and they quantified the amount of nutrients that had left Africa and now been deposited in the United States from dust and erosion. So that's a significant loss of productivity, and ground cover becomes really important, and reducing overgrazing is critical to doing that.
No, thank you. Apparently there's lots of questions in poll everywhere, but I'm not finding them, so I'm just been answering my own, but here we go, there we are. What's the top 5 best practices to build soil organic matter?
In grazing systems, I presume, because we'll leave cropping out of this for now. In grazing systems, nutrients, a balance of nutrients, because basically you've got to remember it's an input-output equation. So the better, the healthier the plants, the more diverse the plants that are growing in the system, the stronger the plants, the more input of carbon that will go into the system, regardless of whatever pathway that you're talking about. So you think about what results in healthier plants: better balance of nutrients, better species composition, and optimal grazing management. So for example, if you allow the plants to get to proper leaf emergence, as they get to leaf emergence, they capture the most amount of photosynthetic activity and can capture as much of the atmospheric CO2 down into the root system. So if you get your grazing management right, you get maximum leaf emergence, you get best plant recovery post-grazing, get the nutrients right, get the species composition right. Those would be the ultimate keys to building healthy soils.
Fabulous, thank you. If you were a farmer, would you invest in testing for a soil carbon trading system, or just focus on building soil organic matter for productivity?
Easy question for me. If I was a farmer, I would just focus on building soil organic matter for the long-term health and productivity of the system, the increased resilience. My looking at soil carbon trading, and sorry if someone else has gone down this track, everyone to their own, just the bureaucracy and paperwork and costs up front, the risk up front of paying for the soil tests, paying for all the MRV, measurement, reporting and verification costs, just seems to me a distraction from the main game, which is farming.
Thank you. So if rainfall is such a big influence, the carbon content of soils in Australia, is there a point in changing management practices to increase soil organic carbon, particularly if there is a trade-off in productivity in pursuing certain management practices?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. We heard a talk last night from a farming business, a corporate farming business that had adjusted their management practices to build soil organic matter, and even through, they showed some fairly convincing data to show that even through the drought, they had managed to hold on to their higher level of soil carbon. It hadn't retreated during the drought. Now, that was a great outcome, and I would say, if you can farm in a way that builds the soil organic matter, you will survive the drought better. But if you keep that practice up and you adjust to the rainfall of your grazing practices, there is a chance you'll hang on to that soil organic matter as well. It won't retreat back to the beginning. So I don't see that there's a downside in terms of adjusting management practices. I would say getting locked into a permanence obligation of having traded soil carbon, that locks you into management that might not be as adaptive as you might need going forward into a variable climate. Whereas focusing just on high soil organic matter in the soil and then allowing yourself to be adaptive in your grazing management, you've got more chance of hanging on to healthy soils into the future. So I don't see that there's a negative trade-off against productivity of having high soil organic matter, but there might be in locking yourself into soil carbon stocks.
Okay, thank you, Richard. How close are we getting, sorry, let me phrase that again. Yeah, how close are we to getting an inexpensive fractionised soil carbon test to know the quantity of rapid and slow seed pools?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because there's a lot of work going on looking at remote sensing methods to verify soil carbon stocks. But that's really just to get a total, most of these remote sensing methods are going to be indirect. They're going to be reading a surrogate. They're going to be reading color or plant growth and reflecting soil carbon as a function of plant growth. That's the best they can do. They can't go down to the fractionation level. Fractionation has to be to get the particulate versus the recalcitrant or resistant forms. You do need to put it through some form of lab analysis. And the techniques that Jeff Baldock published were probably as close as we can get, which are your mid-infrared scanning techniques. They're not prohibitively expensive, but you wouldn't want to be doing every paddock every year going forward. You just want to be picking indicator paddocks on your farm to monitor those fractions.
Sure, thank you. So to what extent is soil water retention increased by increasing soil carbon? So we did talk about, throw some numbers around before. So, for every percent.
Yeah, I think we asked that one. And
yeah, all right. So just last one, looking at Walter Jenny's work on farm management with soil, water and air movement, plus the knowledge that Alan Savory is management, not the answer, not to climate. Not sure what that means, but is management, yeah, I'm not sure what that means. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Walter Jenny and Alan Savory's work. But...
Yeah, look, I'm familiar with it and had a long history there. Look, moving from poor grazing management to good grazing management, whatever term you might give it, whether it's cell grazing or whether it's just a set of principles that are developed to provide adequate rest to the pasture, to graze the pasture at the right leaf stage, to reduce competition between palatable and unpalatable species. If you apply those principles, there will be an overall improvement in soil organic matter as a result. If you run, now, there are no published peer-reviewed papers that would actually show the change in soil organic matter from those systems. Warwick Badgery is probably the closest publication we've got that would show that some form of grazing management can have an impact on soil organic matter. So I encourage you to go and dig up Warwick Badgery's paper. But apart from that, what you're left with is just moving from poor grazing to good grazing. What that define of grazing, whether it's cell grazing or other forms of rotational grazing, you would be almost impossible to separate those out in terms of their effect on soil carbon. If you're just saying moving from poor grazing to good grazing management, I think we can assume that over a 50-year period, there would be a change in soil organic matter as a result.